Thank you for joining me on this trip through one of the scariest cases in history. Today, we are going to go into the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains to see a family that carried a load that no family should have to carry. Please let us know where you are watching from, and get ready, because this story goes beyond what logic can explain. It is not true that this movie was made. It was just made for fun. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is just a coincidence. In the middle of West Virginia, where the mountains rise like, there was a property that people in the area didn't talk about after dark because they thought it held ancient secrets. The ASHFIELD farm was in the middle of nowhere on the slopes of Pocahontas County. It was surrounded by thick forests, and the morning mist never seemed to go away completely. In 1902, the first rumors started to spread through the nearby villages. They were whispered in taverns and in the pews of the many Baptist churches in the area. The ASHFIELDs had lived on those lands before. Their presence went back many generations to when the first people to come to the area cut trails through the winding Appalachians in search of good land and a way to get away from everyone else. The family chose to live away from nearby communities so they could grow tobacco and raise cattle. But the solitude they sought to keep them safe would turn out to be their worst enemy. At that time, Margaret Ashfield was the head of the family. She was a woman with a deep gaze and quiet manners who ran the estate with a firm hand. Her husband had died in certain ways years before. Because they were never fully explained, she was left to keep the family traditions and secrets that had been passed down from generation to generation. The Ashfield family rarely came down from the mountains to do business, but when they did, the closest neighbors who lived miles away noticed something strange every time they saw them in the town of Marlington. A pattern started to stand out. As time went on, the family seemed to. As the number of them continued to drop, and those that were still there looked like they knew something they shouldn't have. The county records showed births, but not many marriages to people from outside the area. The Ashfields seemed to be stuck in a cycle that they couldn't break. They were connected to the land by invisible threads that got stronger with each passing decade. The Marlington Municipal Library's archives held old letters that gave clues about how strange the family was. Letters. Local business owners and county officials talked about deliveries that were never made directly to the Ashfield property. About 2 kilometers from the farm's main entrance, suppliers would leave their goods at a certain spot on the road. They would then come back days later to pick up payment, which was always there, along with lists of new orders written in beautiful handwriting. Thomas Brennan, a traveling doctor, came through the area in 1908 and helped families living alone in the mountains. His diary was found in a book many years later. A dusty trunk in the attic of a boarding house in Charleston held detailed records of his visits. Brennan wrote about how hard it was to get to the Ashfield property. He talked about the narrow paths that wound around mossy rocks and old trees whose branches blocked almost all the sunlight. When the doctor finally got to the main house, he was met with cold but polite help. Margaret let him look at some family members, but she made sure he did it carefully at all times. "Doctor!" Brennan saw something that made him feel uneasy and carefully wrote it down in his notes. All of the people who lived on the property looked a lot alike, like distorted reflections of each other. Their eyes were all the same deep gray color, their bones were all the same shape, and they all had the same distant look that seemed to look through people instead of at them. When the doctor tried to find out about the family history, like marriages and births, he was given vague answers. Margaret only brought up that. There were some things that the family had kept secret for a long time because they were important to them. Before they left, one of Brennan's youngest family members walked him to the edge of the property and stayed quiet the whole time. The doctor heard someone whisper behind him, "Don't come back when the moon is full." Those words stuck in Brennan's mind for weeks. He thought about telling the county about his suspicions. Authorities, But what exactly are they suspicious of? There didn't seem to be any wrongdoing or crime. It was just a strange family living alone in the mountains, like many others in that faraway part of West Virginia. Over the next few years, the Appalachian region went through small but noticeable changes. Slowly, progress made its way to those mountains as railroads were built out and small towns sprung up around coal mines and sawmills. But time had not changed the Ashfield estate. It was like a forgotten island in the middle of a vast ocean of changes. People who lived in Marlington and nearby towns knew not to ask about the family who lived on Pocahontas County's higher slopes. A strange event in 1915 brought the Ashfields back into the public eye. The state of West Virginia hired a surveyor to make a map of the area's land. But the person had to go through some family land. His name was Harold Mitchum, and he was a very organized person who wrote down everything he measured and saw. Mitchum asked for official permission through the... Many people were surprised when, after going through the county's legal channels, Margaret Ashfield said he could go as long as he had a family member with him the whole time. The surveyor agreed to the terms and spent 3 days marking the edges of the properties. Samuel Ashfield, a middle-aged man, was with him. He didn't say much, but paid close attention to everything. During his measurements, Mitchum noticed some odd things. Stone buildings from a long time ago were spread out across the property. The main house seemed a lot younger than that. Some of them were partly hidden by plants, as if someone had been trying to hide them for decades. When Mitchum asked Samuel about these structures, he gave him a vague answer. He said they were the remains of buildings built by early settlers or maybe shelters used by the native people who lived in the area before the Europeans came. But the way Samuel looked away while he spoke made me think of other truths that hadn't been told yet. It was the surveyor. He saw some old trees with strange carvings in the bark that didn't look like anything he knew about the native people or the early settlers in the area. There was an offer for Mitchum to spend the night at the main house on his last night of work before going back to town the next morning. The Ashfields' hospitality was strange and too formal, like they were reading from a script that had been practiced for generations. At a long, dark, wooden table for dinner, the surveyor saw 8 people present, and they all have those striking physical traits. There was no talk about the family's deep history, and the conversation was polite but surface level. It was very early in the morning when Mitchum woke up to a sound he couldn't place right away. Something low and rhythmic was chanting from somewhere under the house. It seemed to be moving through the floorboards. He quietly got up and walked over to his bedroom window, where he could see the grounds lit up by the crescent moon. People with lanterns that swayed like fireflies walked toward one of the stone buildings he had seen during the day from a distance. The surveyor had a chill go down his spine. It wasn't really fear, but a sense that he was seeing something that wasn't meant to be seen by outsiders. He went back to sleep but pretended to be awake when he heard footsteps in the hallway and stayed awake until dawn. He slowly said goodbye the next morning and left as soon as he could. His records are full, but he always had a lot of questions that no one could answer. Mitchum never told anyone what he saw or heard that night. His official reports only had technical information about measurements and landmarks in the area. But in the personal notes that his family found years after he had died, there was a short, strange paragraph. Family trees are more than just blood and name. Those mountains hold packs from long ago, and they protect these secrets better than any vault ever built by people. There is also something interesting in county records from 1915. 3 babies were born in the Ashfield family that year, but no marriages had been recorded in the 5 years before that. The birth certificates only named the mothers, all of whom had the last name Ashfield. They didn't name the fathers. This pattern kept happening over the previous few decades, which was strange, but the people who worked at the registry office either didn't notice it or chose not to question it. Families who lived alone in the mountains had their own ways of doing things. People didn't want to look into it further as long as they paid their taxes and didn't cause trouble in town. Many parts of the United States were able to enjoy good times during the 1920s. The mountains of West Virginia, on the other hand, stayed in their own rhythm and didn't notice how the rest of the world was changing. Around this time, stories with more details started to come out about the Ashfields. Stories that got around in general stores and at the cattle fairs every 3 months. In Marlington. It was strange that these stories could never be traced back to a specific source. It was like they came from the misty ground of the Appalachians. People who drove on the mountain roads said they saw lights dancing on the slopes where the Ashfield property was located every night. They said these weren't normal lanterns. They were lights that pulsed with their own rhythm, appearing and disappearing among the trees as if they were following routes that could only be seen by the people who made them. Some people said they heard voices carried by the wind and words in a language they couldn't figure out. It sounded both very old and very familiar in a scary way. It was in 1923 that a professor of natural history from the University of Virginia went to Pocahontas County to make a list of the medicinal plant species that grew in the higher Appalachian Mountains. His name was Edmund Whittaker, and he had spent years researching how mountain communities used herbs. The Whittaker had especially interested in writing down the knowledge that was being lost as local elders died. Native plants' healing properties have been passed down orally from generation to generation. While he was talking to the older people in Marlington, the name Ashfield kept coming up. People said the family knew a lot about herbs and roots, as well as recipes and mixtures that worked amazingly well. Whittaker was interested, so he decided to try to visit the property, bringing with him university letters of recommendation and gifts as a way of saying thank you. On an autumn afternoon, the leaves on the trees were painting the mountains with shades of red and gold as he climbed the winding path to the farm. As of that moment, Margaret Ashfield was still alive. She was a very old woman, but she was still very clear-headed and seemed to take up more space than her body did. She greeted the professor with careful politeness and listened to him explain the school project, going over the letters he brought. Margaret finally agreed to show Whittaker some of the gardens on the property where they grew plants that he had never seen mentioned in any of his other research. The professor was amazed by the different flower varieties that looked like they were made by crossing species that shouldn't naturally breed with each other. Margaret talked about farming methods that had been passed down through the family in general terms. Needed to be patient and know about the seasons and lunar cycles. Whittaker tried to get more specific about where this knowledge came from. Without giving direct answers, the matriarch did a dance that looked like it had been done for decades. Not only were the plants beautiful, but Margaret talked about them like they were family members, each with their own needs and personalities. They talked about how some plans could only be made by people with the right family tree, that the ASHFIELD blood gave them a special ability to work with plants in a way that no one else could. Whittaker said it might just be technical know-how that had been passed down through the years. Margaret smiled in a way that he couldn't see and told him that science wasn't ready to fully understand everything in the world yet. Before the professor left, he or she met other family members who worked in the gardens. Once more, that unsettling resemblance. Between them all, like small changes to a main theme that kept playing over and over. Whittaker said there was a clear hierarchy on the property, with Margaret at the top and everyone else doing what she said without question. There were no obvious disagreements or family tensions. Instead, there was a perfect harmony that almost seemed fake. During the next few months, Whittaker tried to get back to the house several times, but no one ever answered his messages. It was as if, after telling what as they saw fit, the family shut its doors once more. The professor eventually wrote an academic paper about medicinal plants in the Appalachians, but he didn't talk about the Ashfields because he felt that they held secrets that shouldn't be shared with the world. He wrote down something in his private notes that would interest him for the rest of his life. I've known families who lived alone before, but the Ashfields are different. They don't seem to belong in the present time, as if a part of them still lives in a different era. The United States went through the Great Depression in 1929, following rules and traditions that the rest of the world had given up hundreds of years before. This made life very hard for many families. Strangely, though, the Ashfields didn't seem to be affected by the economic problems that the rest of the country was having. Farmers lost their land and whole families had to move to find work. But the property in the Pocahontas County Mountains kept running the same way it always had, and able to support itself. Marlington merchants noticed that the family's orders never went down, and that payment always showed up on time at the agreed-upon spot on the road. During a time when many things were scarce, this wealth naturally made neighbors who were struggling to survive curious and even angry. There were rumors going around about where the Ashfields' real wealth came from. Some people thought the family had found gold or silver in the ground deep in their land. Others talked about having secret ties with. During Prohibition, bootleggers used the remote mountain trails to transport illegal liquor, but no one had any solid proof. Instead, there was only speculation fueled by the human need to make sense of the unexplainable. A young reporter for the Pocahontas Times chose to look into these stories in 1933. Daniel Crawford was his name, and he wanted to become a well-known investigative reporter. He hoped to get a job at one of Charleston's big newspapers or even somewhere else. Crawford saw that in the Ashfield story a chance to write something interesting, a report that would reveal the secrets of one of the most mysterious families in the area. The reporter started his investigation in a planned way. He looked at public records at the county registry office, talked to people who had lived in the area for a long time, and tried to put together the Ashfield family tree. What he found was both very interesting and very scary. The records showed a pattern that kept happening over and over again in a disturbing way. 100 years, regular births, almost no deaths recorded, and no marriages to people outside the family. It seemed like the Ashfields lived in a closed loop, repeating themselves in ways that were never fully explained by official records. In the dusty archives of the public library, Crawford also found something else. In newspapers from 100 years ago, the Ashfield family was mentioned in strange ways. In 1847, an article talked about a strange fire in a chapel close to the family's home. Real estate. A fire that began for no clear reason after a fight between a traveling preacher and his family members over religious practices that the preachers saw as wrong. In another 1869 newspaper clipping, it was written that a tax collector had gone to the Ashfield farm to settle some property issues and was never seen again. His horse, on the other hand, was found grazing peacefully on the road, unharmed. With these facts in hand, Crawford chose to walk up to the house and talk to the family. Right away. He began his hike on the same trail that many others had taken before him on a foggy March afternoon. It was hard to see more than a few meters ahead because of the thick fog coming down from the higher mountains. As the reporter moved farther away from the main road, he felt more and more alone. The only sounds that broke the silence were his own footsteps and the crow's cries that could be heard far away. When Crawford finally made out the main house through the fog, he saw that people were waiting for him. There were 3 still figures on the porch, as if they knew exactly when he would show up. He thought the woman in front of him was the current head of the family since Margaret had died many years before. Her name was Constance Ashfield, and she had the same scary, piercing gray eyes as the person who came before her. The reporter introduced himself and said what he was there to do, trying to sound professional and sure of himself even though he was getting nervous. Having pain. While she listened, Constance kept her face blank, as if she were not feeling anything. As soon as Crawford was done talking, she told him to respect the family's privacy and not make them the subject of endless public interest. But the way she spoke changed the polite request into something that sounded more like a warning. Crawford insisted, saying that people have a right to know about well-known families in the area and the keeping records of their traditions is important for history. At that point, Constance did something strange. She let the reporter into the house, telling him that since he had come all the way up, he should at least hear the family's sides of the story. The reporter said yes, even though something inside him told him to say no and leave right away. The inside of the house was surprisingly well kept, with furniture that looked hundreds of years old but was in perfect shape. Portraits, wall, with faces that looked so much alike that they might have been painted over and over by the same person. Crawford thought that Constance's story about how her family came to be was a romanticized version of the truth. She talked about ancestors who came from the Scottish Highlands and brought with them knowledge and traditions that go back to the beginning of time. She talked about deals made with the land itself, where people promised to take care of it and keep it safe in exchange for safety and wealth. The newsperson. He quickly took notes, but as Constance spoke, he felt more and more uneasy. It seemed like her words had weight, like they meant more than what they said on the surface. She talked about rituals for planting and harvesting that sounded more like religious events than farming tasks. She was talking about how important it was to keep the lineage pure and protect what had been given to the ASHFIELD family for generations. Of course, she always came back to the idea that some things were better kept secret. World, safe in the mountain's shade, where they had grown and thrived for a long time. When Crawford finally left the Ashfield estate that afternoon, the sun was already going down behind the faraway mountain peaks. The sky was a strangely intense shade of orange and purple. The reporter held on tight to his notes, but he was having a hard time concentrating. Something had changed in his mind during the time he spent in the house. The stories Constance told had a strange, hypnotic effect, and he started to wonder why he was looking into the family. There may have been things that were better left unsaid, secrets that were meant for reasons other than newsworthiness. Over the next few weeks, Crawford tried to put together an article from his notes, but he had trouble putting what he had seen and heard into words that made sense on paper. When he tried to write about the most upsetting parts of the visit, he seemed to lose his grip. Momentum. It seemed like an invisible force was stopping him from talking about some things. He said it was because he was tired and stressed, but he knew it was really something else. In the end, the article he published in the Pocahontas Times was a dull and unremarkable history of the area's pioneer families. The Ashfields were only briefly mentioned as an example of mountain self-sufficiency. What Crawford never told anyone was what happened to him when he was on the property for the last time. When? He went to the door with Constance, and she put her hand on his shoulder in a way that felt like it went through his clothes and into him. She whispered something to him that he couldn't quite remember afterward, but it stuck in his mind. It had something to do with choices and consequences, and how important it is to leave some shadows alone. At that moment, the reporter felt like he was being both warned and forgiven, as if his interruption had been planned, which was already being forgotten by everyone in the mountains. The whole country went through big changes from 1941 to 1945 because of World War II. Young men from all over the country were forced to join the military. Factories changed their production lines to help win the war, and communities changed how they worked around the needs of the country. But the Ashfield family seemed to have been remarkably unaffected by these changes. It was strange that none of its members were forced to join the military. Raised some eyebrows, but it was never fully looked into. Records showed that people were given exemptions for medical or farming reasons. paperwork that always looked perfect when it was looked at by the right people. During this time, the Ashfield estate actually grew its business. Due to a lack of conventional medicines, they started sending medicinal herbs and herbal preparations to hospitals in the area to meet the rising demand. The doctors who got these packages were impressed by how well they worked, especially on injuries that wouldn't heal with regular treatments. No one asked exactly what ingredients were used or how these preparations were made. When people were really in need, results were more important than where the goods came from. During these years, a nurse named Virginia Hayes had an experience she would never talk about again. She wrote about it only in her personal diary, which was found decades later by people studying the region's medical history. Virginia worked at the Pocahontas County Hospital and was in charge of giving treatments made from herbs from the Ashfield farm. She saw that some patients responded to these preparations in strange ways. Not only did their health get better, but they also said they had vivid dreams and felt connected to something bigger than themselves. Virginia was interested and decided to visit the property in person in 1944. She used the need to talk about specifics of the formulations as an excuse. More effectively, give them to patients. When the nurse arrived, Constance Ashfield greeted her with the same cold courtesy that her family used with everyone else. This time, though, there was something different. Virginia was a woman, so that might have been it. It's also possible that the matriarch was moved by how much she cared for the sick. No matter what the reason was, Constance let the nurse see more than she usually let visitors see. Virginia was amazed as she walked through the medicinal gardens. She was amazed at how carefully and in what kinds of ways everything was grown. But it was in a special greenhouse hidden behind the main house and partly covered by old vines that she saw something that she couldn't understand. Plants growing in patterns that didn't make sense, weaving together in ways that didn't seem to follow the rules of botany. In the dim light of the greenhouse, the flowers gave off a soft glow that pulsed with a rhythm that made me think of slow, deep breathing. Constance said that these were the real, as sources of power in the Ashfield preparations. These were cultivars that the family had grown over hundreds of years by carefully experimenting and passing on knowledge. She said that the soil in the nearby mountains was special because it was full of minerals and elements that came from deep inside the earth. This made it perfect for these particular plants. But it wasn't just the chemistry of the soil. Constance said that there was intention, or the controlled will of those who cultivated. There was a link between the Ashfield blood and the land through these plants that went beyond simple farming. Virginia listened, interested and a little scared. What her eyes and instincts were telling her went against what she had learned in school about science. Constance smiled, a smile that carried centuries of wisdom and maybe a touch of sadness. She seemed to sense this inner conflict. The nurse didn't have to fully understand to keep helping her heal, she said. Some things were better experienced, then explained, felt, or made sense of. It was important that the patients were getting better and that their pain was being eased. Virginia was shown to a room in the main house that looked like it was used for family records before she left. There were shelves on the walls that were full of leather-bound books, diaries, and notebooks that held records from many generations of Ashfields. Constance let the nurse look through some of these books. They were all written in the same beautiful handwriting that seemed to be used by everyone. Stayed the same over the years. They were very detailed records of botanical experiments, observations on the moon's phases, and how they affect plants, births, and other important family events. Virginia was most upset by the portraits in that room, which were different from the others she had seen in the house. These were clearly very old, some of them, from before photography, and were painted by hand in styles that made me think of different centuries. But it was clear that the faces were Ashfield. Those same dark gray eyes and bone, structure, and the same way of expressing secret knowledge. It was like looking through a time tunnel and seeing the same essence show up over and over again in slightly different ways. Constance could tell that the nurse was upset, so she gave her an explanation that sounded both reassuring and very scary. She said that different generations were chosen to take on different roles over time. For example, she said that the Ashfields were in charge of keeping information alive from before Europeans came to the Americas, and maybe even before that. The family had been given these traditions and protected them, not because they were selfish, but because people outside the family were not ready to understand or use them wisely. Virginia Hayes' view of reality had completely changed by the time she left the Ashfield estate that day. She wrote in her diary about her thoughts on the limits of modern science and the idea that there might be other systems of knowledge that are just as valid but work in different ways. She never told anyone what she saw in the secret greenhouse or the specifics of the talks she had with Constance. She kept giving her patients the Ashfield preparations with even more care and respect, seeing them not as just medicines but as ways to connect with other people who see the world in different ways. Many parts of the United States felt happy and prosperous again after World War II. The Ashfields were carefully kept away from other people, but they brought changes that started to threaten that. The roads were. As technology got better and communication grew, the world got smaller and more linked. It wasn't as hard to get to the Appalachians as it used to be, and it was getting harder and harder to keep secrets in a time of rising scientific interest and openness. The 1950s were a time when things changed quickly in the United States. People could watch TV, pop culture was growing, and a new generation was coming of age with different goals than the last. Parents. It took longer for these changes to happen in the mountains of West Virginia, but they did happen. Telephone lines were put in places that didn't have them before, and dirt roads were paved, making it easier to get to places that took hours to get to before. For the Ashfield family, these changes meant problems they had never faced before in the way they had lived for generations. The state government began a rural electrification project in 1952 with the goal of giving all farms electricity, land in the county of Pocahontas. It was a big job that would require putting up poles and transmission lines through mountainous areas, some of which would be on the Ashfield estate. The engineers in charge of the project thought that some of the more traditional families might be against it, but when they tried to talk to the Ashfields about letting the lines go through their land, they were shocked by how strongly they felt about it. Constance Ashfield, who is now old but still. With all of her clarity and power, she flatly refused to let anyone change her property. She said that the family was self-sufficient and didn't need electricity from outside sources. She said that their traditions and way of life were perfect for the way things were. Representatives from the government tried to explain the advantages of modernization and the ease of life that electricity would bring, but Constance would not change. That she wouldn't do it wasn't just simple resistance to change. The engineers could feel it, but they weren't sure what it was. In the end, an agreement was reached after months of talks and long court cases that went through the county courts. The transmission lines would go around the Ashfield property by taking a longer, more expensive, and technically difficult route that would still go around the farm's edges. It was an unusual concession that made other landowners in the area say things, but it also showed how powerful the influence was. The family kept up, even though they stayed away from others. Some said the Ashfields were very influential in Charleston's politics. Others said there were old legal papers that gave them special rights. The truth stayed a secret, as it always does with this family. In the towns and cities near Marlington, something interesting started to happen during this time. Young people who had heard vague stories about the Ashfield family as kids became interested in them again. It was no longer just sad. Not out of curiosity or superstition, but because of a real interest sparked by the growing counterculture that questioned established values and looked for new ways of knowing. Some of these young people didn't see the Ashfields as strange or scary. They saw them as people who might be able to keep alive knowledge that modern society had lost in its haste to become more industrialized and standardized. One of these young men was Marcus Webb, who was in college and had come back to his hometown in the summer of 1958 after finishing his. He was in his second year of studying anthropology at West Virginia University. He had heard stories about the Ashfields since he was a child, but now he saw them through the lens of his studies. He thought that the family might be a unique example of a culture that had survived, a living example of beliefs and practices that had been wiped out by the relentless march of modernization in other places. With the cockiness of a teenager and the confidence that came from going to college, Marcus decided that he would finally keep accurate records of the Ashfield family. He worked on his plan for weeks, reading everything he could find in local archives and talking to older people in the area to try to understand not only the facts but also how this mysterious family made him feel. It was the height of technology at the time, so he borrowed a camera and a tape recorder and hiked up the trail to the Ashfield property on a clear August morning. In this case, it wasn't Constance who was getting visitors. The family's matriarch had died a few months before, and Eleanor Ashfield, who was from the next generation, took over as head of the family. If the matriarchs before Eleanina had been scary, she was nothing like them. When she became leader, she was younger than the people who came before her, but she had a presence that combined the family's traditional authority with a strong awareness of how things were changing in the outside world. With her usual gray eyes, she looked at Marcus with a seriousness that made him feel like he was being read to in ways he didn't understand. The young students were shocked when Eleanor didn't send him away right away. Instead, she let him talk about his project, and she listened carefully as Marcus talked about preserving culture, how important it is to record traditions that are dying out, and how much he respected the way of life his family had kept alive. After his well-rehearsed speech, Eleanina was quiet for a long time, as if he were thinking about something inside himself. Source of knowledge before she made her choice. She finally spoke, and what she said was a surprise. "It might be time for a limited record to be made," Eleanina said, because things were changing in ways that needed new approaches. However, there were strict rules. Marcus could ask her questions and even take pictures, but only of things she gave him permission to do. People would not be able to go to certain parts of the property or listen in on certain conversations. Family life would also be kept private. That wouldn't be talked about. If he agreed to these conditions and didn't question any of them, she might ask him to help her with her research. Marcus happily said yes, almost unable to believe his good luck. Over the next few days, he went back to the property several times, each time being led by Eleanor or another family member through carefully chosen parts of the farm. The medicinal gardens were photographed, but the gardens in the more remote parts of the property were not. He wrote down talks about old ways of farming, stories about the first people who came to the area, and thoughts on how important it is to be connected to the land. It was all very interesting. Everything helped him with his school project. But Marcus always had the feeling that he was only seeing the top of something much bigger. Some of the time, he saw family members talking to each other through glances, giving each other information without words, in ways that seemed more than just normal. You know, he sometimes heard bits of conversations in a language he couldn't place. It wasn't English or any of the European languages he had spent time learning, and he always felt like he was being watched, not just by his visible family members, but also by people who lived all over the earth. Marcus was taking pictures of some old stone buildings on the edge of the property one afternoon when he saw patterns carved into the rocks. that seemed to be a lot older than the time when Europeans lived in the area. Eleanor gave him a deliberately vague answer when he asked her about them. She said that maybe they were marks made by native people who lived in those mountains before the settlers did. However, the way she spoke and the weight of her words made it seem like she knew a lot more than she was letting on. Marcus tried to gently ask Eleanor for more information, but she shut him down. I just changed the subject and pointed out other things about the property. Not long after starting his investigation, the student quickly learned that there were real but invisible lines that he should not cross in order to keep the special access he had been given. It was hard for him to balance his academic interest with his duty to show respect to the people who were keeping the secrets he was trying to find. Eleanor invited Marcus to dinner at the main restaurant during one of her last visits before going back to school. House. It seemed strange to be sitting at the same long table where so many other guests had been greeted with the ASHFIELD's distinctively formal hospitality. The food was simple, but it was made with care, which made each dish stand out. Marcus wasn't sure what herbs were in the mixtures, but the flavors seemed to bring back memories he didn't know he had, and the sensations were both familiar and strange. She talked about her family over the meal. History in a more honest way than she had before. She said that the ASHFIELDs didn't just end up in the mountains by accident, but because of traditions that go back much further than America itself. She talked about how important it was to be in certain places on Earth, where energies came together in unique ways, and the line between reality and illusion was thinner. The mountains were one of those places, she said, and the family had been led there to be guardians and keep the balance that. A lot of people didn't even know it existed. Marcus listened with an anthropological mind that was trying to put what he was hearing into groups based on traditional belief systems, animism, or other ideas he had studied. But Eleanor seemed to understand his attempts to make sense of things and smiled in that mysterious way that all ASHFIELDs did. She said that analysis couldn't explain everything, and that there were parts of reality that wouldn't fit into any academic categories. Be felt directly in order to be truly known. Marcus felt like he had touched something important when he left the property for the last time that summer, carrying his photos, recordings, and long notes, but he still couldn't figure out what the ASHFIELD was really like. In the years that followed, he tried more than once to turn his work into a good academic thesis, but he always failed because words could not describe what he had been through. The pictures didn't look as good as the clear memories he had. The recordings had the words, but they didn't have the emotional depth or weight of unspoken meanings that were part of each conversation. Marcus Webb gave up on anthropology in the end and went after a different career. He would never forget his time with the ASHFIELDs, though. When he was in his mid-40s, decades later, he wrote a personal essay about the event, not for academic publication but just for himself, to try to make sense of what he had been through. In this paper, he said that maybe we shouldn't fully understand everything, that there was value in mystery, and that the ASHFIELDs, by not fitting in with modern expectations, were holding on to something important that most people had lost in their quest for progress and logical explanations. In the 1960s, there was a cultural revolution in the United States that made people question traditional values and look for new ways to understand the world. In a strange way, it was during this time of rebellion against it became clear that the ASHFIELD family was getting a different kind of attention. The Appalachians were a place of authenticity for young people who were part of the Back to the Land movements, looked for other spiritual connections, and didn't like how consumer society was so focused on material things. People who are interested in spirituality spread rumors across the country about a family that lived alone and followed ancestral traditions while keeping old knowledge alive. Eleanor Ashfield. I carefully watched these changes in culture with interest. Before her, the matriarch had kept the family completely cut off from the rest of the world. But now that cultures were becoming more open, she saw opportunities in it. She didn't mean to spill the family's deepest secrets, but she wondered if there were ways to better protect their privacy by using the growing interest in alternative wisdoms to hide the truths beneath layers of mysticism that would appeal to the new counterculture. In 1965, a trip to the mountains of West Virginia was planned by college students from across the country as part of a larger project to record alternative communities and traditional ways of life that didn't fit into the mainstream American culture. They had heard pieces of stories about the ASHFIELDs through the informal networks of communication that existed among counterculture movements. These stories made the family sound like they might be guardians of secret knowledge and old practices. The group had a leader, by a young woman named Sarah Brennan, who was the granddaughter of the doctor who had been to the property many years before. At the time, she didn't know that she had a family connection to the doctor. Sarah and her friends got to Marlington at the end of summer, when the mountains were covered in the most beautiful, lush, green plants. Unlike previous visitors who just walked up the trail to the property without telling anyone, this group decided to be more polite. They spent days in town talking to people and learning about the customs of the area and figuring out the best way to get in touch with the family they were looking for. This patience would pay off in a way that no one expected. The group was having coffee at a small restaurant in the area one morning when a woman came up to their table. The young people were asking Elelena Ashfield about her family. She had been in town for business when she heard about it. She introduced herself with the quiet elegance that comes from being from the Ashfields and asked directly about what the group was trying to do. Sarah was shocked, but tried to keep her cool as she told them about her project. She made sure to stress that she respected different ways of life and wanted to learn instead of taking advantage. Elelena looked at the group with those deep, gray eyes that seemed to be able to read more than what was being said. Everybody felt awkward for a long time during the silence. Then she made a choice that even surprised her. She told the group they couldn't go on the property visit, but she did invite them. Specifics. They were welcome to stay for 3 days and watch and learn about certain parts of the family's life. Nobody would take pictures or record what they saw or heard, and Eleanor would decide how to handle any information they got. Most importantly, they should go with an open mind, not expecting anything specific, and be ready to accept what was revealed without pushing for more. The group gladly agreed, and 2 days later they followed Elelena along a winding path that led to the land at Ashfield. Many of them said that the hike itself changed them. They noticed that as they got closer to the family's land, the forest changed. It became both livelier and quieter, as if they were entering a place with slightly different rules than the rest of the forest. Sarah noticed that the birds were singing in different patterns, and that the light coming through the trees had a slightly different, almost golden color. It looks like everything is surrounded by a soft aura. They were met by other family members who seemed to have been waiting for them when they finally got to the property. Even though all of the Ashfields looked a lot alike, the group had read about isolated communities and the effects of generations of marriages in small groups, so they were ready. What surprised them the most was how well the family members seemed to get along with each other, a kind of quiet cooperation that looked like it was planned out. It seemed very natural, like everyone knew their part and how it fit into the bigger picture. Visitors were shown carefully chosen parts of the Ashfield family's life during their 3 days on the property. They helped harvest plants in the medicinal gardens and learned about many of them that they had never seen before. They also listened to explanations of healing properties that mixed facts with ideas that were almost supernatural. Eleanor told us everything, speaking in a way that the group could understand, using terms from new holistic medicine and counterculture ideas about energy balance, but there was always a sense that there were deeper meanings that weren't being fully revealed. Elelena called the group to what she called a ceremony of gratitude to the earth on the second night. It was one of the most moving things that happened. They were taken to a forest clearing not far from the main house, where the ground had been. The area was cleared, and circles of old stones made a pattern that looked like it had a purpose, but no one knew what it was. Around the outside, lanterns were lit, making a ring of soft light that cast deep shadows on the trees around it that seemed to have their own life. The Ashfield family sat in certain spots around the circle, and Eleanor told the guests to sit in the middle and watch without taking part. What happened next was something that would defy attempts to describe by everyone who was there for years to come. There wasn't really singing going on when the Ashfields started to chant. Instead, they were making noises that seemed to resonate through the water and the ground. No one in the group could figure out what the words, if they were words, were written in. Sounds that seemed so old that they couldn't have happened in our lifetime. Sarah could feel something moving around her. It was like there was pressure in the air that wasn't real, but it was there, possible to see. There were shadows moving on the edges of the clearing that didn't match the way the lantern flames were moving. There were smells in the air that didn't seem to come from anywhere. Those smells made her think of times and places she had never been or lived. Later, other people in the group would describe similar feelings, though they would each describe something slightly different. However, they all agreed that something very important had happened in that clearing. That went beyond common explanations. The ceremony went on for about an hour, but time seemed to have blurred and become hard to keep track of. When the Ashfields finally stopped chanting and the strange feelings started to go away, it was clear that there had been some kind of communication between the family and forces that the visitors could hardly imagine. Eleanor didn't give a full explanation of what happened. All she said was that it was something her family did. For generations, as a way to keep the balance between their presence on the land and the energies of the mountains that lived there. On the third and last day of the visit, Eleanor took Sarah for a walk around the property by herself, while she left the other people in the group with other Ashfields. The matriarch talked about ideas she didn't usually share with the strangers as they walked along trails that led through more remote parts of the farm. She talked about the Ashfield family tree as more than just a family. Not in the usual sense, but as a continuity of consciousness that went back many generations. Each member was both an individual and a part of something bigger, a kind of collective entity that held the knowledge and duties that ancestors had given them from the beginning of time. Sarah listened, interested and a little scared. She was trying to make sense of ideas that made her think about what it means to be an individual. She talked about choices that were made a long time before any of were born the current Ashfields. Agreements made by their ancestors with beings that lived in these mountains before people could remember. She said that the family wasn't just keeping traditions alive. They were also part of a bigger web of responsibilities and connections that kept balances and forces that most people didn't even realize were there. When they got to a high point on the property, they could see valleys and mountain peaks miles away. Eleanor stopped and looked straight into Sarah's eyes. She said something next that the young woman would never forget. In her speech, Eleanor said that she had noticed something unique about Sarah, an openness or sensitivity that most people didn't have. She said that maybe Sarah's being led there wasn't a coincidence, and that there were bigger patterns at work that were bigger than any one person's conscious planning. After that, the matriarch said that she knew that Sarah's family had a connection to Dr. Brennan, who had been to the property many years before, which Sarah herself had no idea about. Eleanor said that the Ashfields kept so many detailed records of important people who crossed their paths that nothing was ever forgotten. It was clear to the family that the doctor had seen more than met the eye. He or she had chosen to respect the mysteries rather than try to force answers. Eleanor said that she still had this same quality. Granddaughter. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions, honor and fear, intertwining in ways she didn't know were possible. Elelanina continued, saying that the world was changing in ways that would affect even carefully maintained isolations like that of the Ashfields. The coming decades would bring challenges that would require new approaches, perhaps even new alliances with those in the outside world who could understand and respect what the family protected. She wasn't making an explicit invitation, but the implication was clear. Sarah was being considered as someone who could serve as a bridge between the Ashfields and the outside world at some point in the future. When the group finally left the property at the end of the third day, they were all profoundly transformed by the experience, but in ways they would struggle to articulate for the rest of their lives. They had touched something genuinely ancient and mysterious, something that existed on the fringes of consensual reality, and this experience would mark them permanently. Sarah, in particular, would carry the weight of what Elelanina had shared with her, the awareness of having been chosen for some purpose not yet fully revealed. In the months and years that followed, the group would maintain contact with one another, meeting occasionally to discuss what they had experienced and to try to make sense of it in terms that fit their evolving worldviews. But there was always a sense that words failed, that the true nature of what they had witnessed resisted linguistic capture. Some members of the group would eventually dismiss the experience as a kind of mass hysteria, or the result of suggestion and expectation. Others would hold on to it as a central event in their lives, proof that reality was far richer and stranger than conventional frameworks allowed. Sarah Brennan would follow a different path from her companions. She would return to the mountains of West Virginia several times in the following years, always making respectful contact with the Ashfields before her visits, always being received with that formal but genuine hospitality. Slowly, over the years, Elelanina would reveal more layers of knowledge, always carefully calibrating how much to share, always testing to see if Sarah was ready for deeper understandings. It was a kind of initiation that didn't follow any formal script, but was no less real for its organic and improvised nature. The 70s and 80s brought even more profound changes to the world, and even the isolated Appalachian mountains could not remain completely untouched. Technology was advancing at a rapid pace. Globalization was beginning to connect distant places in unprecedented ways, and access to information was expanding exponentially. For the Ashfield family, these transformations represented both threats and opportunities. Eleanor, now a woman of considerable age, but still firmly in charge of the family, needed to navigate increasingly turbulent waters to keep the secrets of her lineage protected, while simultaneously ensuring the family's survival in a world that no longer tolerated complete isolation. In 1973, an unexpected crisis forced the Ashfields to interact with the legal system in ways they had never needed to before. The federal government initiated a comprehensive environmental survey of the Appalachian Mountains as part of broader conservation efforts. Teams of scientists and biologists began mapping ecosystems, cataloging plant and animal species, and identifying areas of particular ecological significance. The Ashfields' property with its extensive preserved forest areas and remarkable. Biodiversity naturally attracted the researchers' attention. Elelanina knew that simply denying access would no longer be a viable option as it had been in the past. Federal laws had become more comprehensive, and the family could not afford to attract negative attention from federal authorities. Instead, she adopted a different strategy. She carefully negotiated the terms of access, allowing limited studies to be conducted on specific portions of the property while keeping critical areas completely off-limits under the pretext of preserving sacred sites of Native American ancestors, a claim that was partially true but concealed far more complex realities. The scientists who came to study the property were impressed by what they found. The biodiversity was extraordinary, with several plant species they had never seen documented in that specific region. some of which defied easy classification within established taxonomies. The plants were also spread out in strange ways, as if some plants could only grow in certain places, surrounded by invisible but seemingly solid lines. The researchers thought this was because of changes in the soil and microclimates, but they never thought that there might be other factors at play. Robert Chen was one of the biologists working on the project. He was an ethnobotanist who was interested in how different cultures use native plants for ritual and medical purposes. Chen saw that some of the specimens he found on the Ashfield property matched vague descriptions of creatures that lived in the past. Appalachian healing practices, but with traits that suggested they had been carefully cultivated for many generations. He asked for permission to talk to family members about their traditional knowledge of plants because he was interested. Cheryl agreed to meet with Chen. She did a lot of research on him on her own, though, and found that he had a reputation for respecting the cultures he studied, not using native knowledge for personal gain, and keeping the traditions alive. When it's appropriate, confidentiality. She agreed to a number of conversations that took place over several months in 1974 because she was happy with what she had learned. She carefully controlled the flow of information at all times and never said more than she thought was safe. It amazed Chen how much the Ashfields knew about plants and how well they knew it. Eleanor showed him ways to grow plants that were a mix of careful observation and practices that were almost ritualistic ways to make medicines from plants. Time, temperature, and even the preparer's mental state had to be taken into account. The scientist saw parts of several traditions woven together in interesting ways. It was like the Ashfields had put together knowledge from many sources over many years to make something completely new. Chen was most interested in Elena's vague references to ideas that he had only seen in studies of shamanic practices from places very different from Appalachian America. She talked about plants, as if they were living things that could be talked to, of the need to build relationships with plant spirits before harvesting them, and of how the grower's blood and intentions had a big impact on the plants that came from their work. These were ideas that modern science has mostly written off as myths. But Chen was willing to consider that there might be layers of reality that his tools and methods were not able to quantify. Chen was brave during one of their last talks to find out where the family's knowledge came from, hoping to find cultural transmission lines that go back to the first European settlers or the area's native people. Elena kept quiet for a long time, her gray eyes fixed on something other than the scientist, as if she were looking at memories from a time before her own. When she finally spoke, she chose her words carefully, but they had more than one meaning. She said that some things were not learned in the usual way, but were passed down through families, in ways that went beyond talking or writing it down. She said that some families had memories stored in their blood at deeper levels than genetics. These memories could be accessed through practices and states of consciousness that modern science had given up on in its quest for objectivity and reproducibility. She said that the Ashfields were part of this lineage, and that they were either chosen or cursed to carry the responsibilities that came with having access to types of knowledge that most people had lost or never had. Chen listened with the mind of a scientist looking for ways to explain things, but also with the intuition of someone who had spent enough time with traditional cultures to know that there were real things that Western science couldn't explain. He wasn't sure if he really believed what Elena said, but he had a lot of respect for how strongly she spoke and how her beliefs made sense to him. When the project to do an environmental survey when they were done in 1975, the Ashfields had safely navigated potentially dangerous waters. It was written down that the land was an area of ecological significance, which, ironically, gave it even more legal protections against future development. When the scientists left, they had useful information and a deeper appreciation for the family who had taken such good care of these lands. Elelena had also made connections with some researchers who might be useful in the future. Bridges were carefully built between the isolated world of the Ashfields and places of business in the outside world. In the 1980s, new problems came up because herbal medicines and traditional knowledge became more popular in business. Pharmaceutical companies started to see how valuable indigenous and traditional knowledge could be. They sent people to rural areas to find information that they could use to make products that would make them money. There's a growing reputation among some academics that the Ashfield estate does some very special things with plants, started to get unwanted attention from these business interests. These approaches were met with firmness by Elelena. She turned down all offers, no matter how good the money, to sell or share the family's knowledge. When pushed, she made it clear through the right legal channels that the Ashfields would fiercely defend their intellectual and cultural property, and that they had enough money and connections to make it very expensive for anyone to try to take it. There was some of it. Bluff, but it worked, and the companies eventually moved on to easier targets. During this time, Sarah Brennan, who was now an adult and lived on her own, had become Eleanor's unofficial protégé. She often went to the estate and stayed for weeks at a time. While there, she learned not only about plants and medicines, but also about the deeper ideas that guided the ASHFIELD practices. Even though Elelena was still very strong, she was getting older and starting to think about her legacy and who would take over when she died. Matriarchs might not have had to think about it. Eleanor's biggest worry was how to keep the Ashfield family line going in a world that was changing so quickly that future generations would not be able to live in complete isolation. The family would have to find ways to change without losing who they are, to interact with the outside world in a way that keeps their deepest secrets safe. Sarah stood for a chance, a link between worlds. She wasn't related to Ashfield by blood, but she had shown that they understood and were willing to respect what the family stood for. In 1987, Elelena made a choice that had never been made before in the family's history. She gave Sarah the chance to join the Ashfield family tree officially through a process she only vaguely called an adoption that involved more than just legal paperwork. It would be a big change for Sarah, tying her to her family's memories and duties in ways that went beyond relationships that are common. Eleanor made it clear that Sarah shouldn't make this choice lightly. There would be costs and sacrifices that she needed to think about carefully. When Sarah asked for time to think, Elelena gave it to her because she knew what a big decision Sarah was making. The young woman thought about what she knew about the Ashfields for months, comparing it to her own life and goals and trying to picture what it would be like to fully follow a path that was so different from everything modern the society offered. There was a choice between two worlds, and she couldn't be sure of what she was picking until it was too late. Sarah had to make a choice that resounded through the mountains like an old whisper, carrying the weight of choices that went beyond a single life. Her feet felt the ground as she walked the Appalachian trails for months, as if she were trying to say something that words could never express. The estate at Ashfield had turned into a second home for thee. It looked like the lines between what was possible and what was impossible were less clear. In this world, alternative realities were not just ideas in the mind, they were real-life experiences. Elelena watched Sarah's thought process with the patience that comes from knowing for a long time that some paths can't be forced, only offered. The matriarch knew she was asking Sarah to give up not only a way of life, but also a whole way of life, getting to know who she is. It was both an invitation to join something bigger and a warning that being part of something bigger meant being alone and taking on responsibilities that few people were ready to handle. The mountains went through different seasons, each with its own colors and moods. The colors on the slopes were fiery in the fall. In the winter, they were surrounded by white noise. They woke up in the spring with bursts of new green, and by the summer they were fully grown and golden. Sarah saw all of these cycles and felt more and more connected to the cycles that controlled not only nature but also the family that knew how to live with forces most people couldn't even see. During her visits, she started to notice things she hadn't seen before. The way the family members moved in ways that looked like they were planned, but were clearly not, as if they were reacting to invisible signals. She was still learning to understand the conversations and bits and pieces of that ancient language, which she now knew was much older than any European language. It was a language that may have been spoken before the native peoples who lived on these lands, and there was always that feeling that there were many levels of reality in the same space, only separated by veil-like barriers that some people knew how to climb. Elelena started to tell stories that were more in-depth than what she had previously said. These stories didn't have exact dates or well-defined characters, but they did contain truths about the Ashfield family tree. She talked about how the family was doing, more than just a guardian of knowledge. They were part of a bigger web of duties that reached across dimensions that modern physics was just starting to think about. She said that there were other groups like them all over the world, with different lineages and goals. These groups were all keeping the delicate balances that kept consensual reality stable. Sarah listened to these revelations with a growing mix of fear and admiration. She was starting to understand that saying yes to Elelena's invitation would mean not only changed her life, but also changed who she was at her core. If you died in one world and came back to life in another, you would have memories of both but really only belong to the second. She was warned about cults and being manipulated by the logical part of her mind. But deep down, she knew that what the Ashfields showed was real truth that worked at frequencies that were outside of normal human understanding. The months turned into a year, and then another. Elelena never pushed anyone, never. Demanded an answer, but instead kept living and teaching, letting Sarah see the family's life in all of its contradictions and complexities. In today's rush for progress and individualism, people have lost the harmony that made that way of life beautiful. But there was also being alone, carrying secrets that couldn't be told, and knowing that they were always one step away from the world most people lived in. It was late in the summer, and the air was thick with. Sarah finally made up her mind when she smelled flowers that didn't grow anywhere else. Elelena was sitting on the porch of the main house, looking out at the mountains that went on and on all the way to the horizon. The two women didn't say anything for a long time because they knew what they were saying. Sarah only said she was ready, as if anyone could really be ready for such a big change. Elelena nodded, and her old face showed that she was happy, or maybe even relieved. She looked forward to this. Answer, but I've never been sure it would come. It was always possible for the bloodline to go in a different direction, because it depended on the choices of individuals. What happened in the days and weeks that followed would always be fuzzy in Sarah's mind, like a mist that made it impossible to remember clearly. The whole family took part in ceremonies and rituals that took place in secret places on the property. She could feel forces she couldn't see. There were times when it hurt that. It wasn't physical, but spiritual, like being rewritten at the most basic levels of being. There were also revelations that helped her see things more clearly in ways that could never be explained in everyday language. After everything was said and done, Sarah Brennan was still there, but not in the same way. She changed her name to Sarah Ashfield and gained access to memories that spanned generations and knowledge that was stored in her in ways that went beyond words. Normal ways of learning. She could feel the estate's land as an extension of herself. She could feel the energy flowing through the mountains and understand how plants and winds talked in ways that she had never been able to before. Elelena was very happy as she watched her new daughter. the lineage would live on, changing to meet the needs of the modern world while still upholding old duties. There would be even more rapid changes in the outside world. The technology would. Good luck. Societies would change. But here in the Appalachians, the Ashfields would stay the same as they always had been, guardians of mysteries that people weren't ready to fully understand, but were necessary for the functioning of realities that most people would never believe existed. The next few decades would bring new chances and problems. There would be new ways for the internet to connect people all over the world. There would be free flow of information. K's hidden things would become getting harder and harder to keep. Yet, the Ashfield family had been through changes before and been able to stay true to itself during those times. Now that Sarah was part of the family tree, they had a link to the modern world. Someone who could easily move between realities to protect what needed to be protected and make changes to what needed to be changed. And so the story goes on. Within the mountain ranges, where mists that never end protect old truths, there is a family that is more than. Family watches over the delicate balances that let different realities live together in a state of unstable harmony. Travelers still sometimes say they see strange lights on the slopes, hear voices carried by the night winds, and feel watched by beings that aren't hostile, but also aren't human in the usual sense. The mountains are very good at keeping their secrets, and the Ashfields keep dancing between revealing and hiding things, giving just enough of a hint to keep things interesting, but never giving away all the answers. That are important because they are still mysteries. There might be wisdom in this, in realizing that not everything needs to be explained, that there is value in leaving some shadows and silences alone. And those of us who have heard these stories told down through the years now carry a piece of this mystery with us, a hint that the world is much stranger and richer than we usually think it is. The mountains keep calling to people who can see and hear them. They don't give answers, but not certainties, but better questions that push us to explore the edges of what we know and what we don't know. If this trip through the Appalachians moved you or made you curious about the mysteries that still live in the world's forgotten places, you might want to subscribe to get more stories that explore the lines between history and legend, reality and possibility. Leave a comment about places that seem to hold the memory of something older that you've been to than the present day. Remember that the best stories are the ones that are told over and over again, passing them down from one generation to the next. This keeps alive the mysteries that make us human, like our ability to imagine, question, and be amazed by things we don't fully understand yet.